Hi everyone and welcome. My name is Vee Kativhu. I'm a young leader of the Sustainable Development Goals here at the United Nations. I'm also a girls' education activist and an empowerment YouTuber talking about all things youth. And today we're joined by a very, very special guest, the Secretary-General of the United Nations, and I'm excited to ask him questions about the Summit of the Future, our common agenda, what does it all mean, and how does it impact youth? So join me in welcoming the Secretary-General. Thank you so much for being here today.
Great pleasure.
Thank you. And I'd love to just start at the beginning. What is your role here at the United Nations? What does it mean to be a Secretary-General? And how does the work of youth impact your work?
Well, some people think that the Secretary of the United Nations has a lot of power or manages a lot of money. It's not true. What the Secretary General can do is to be a voice on behalf of the principles of the Charter of the United Nations, of international law, of equality and justice in international relations. And at the same time, the Secretary General has some convening power, namely the Summit of the Future, is to tell people, leaders around the world, look, something is not going well. Let's get together and let's try to fix what needs to be fixed. And indeed, when you look at today's world, you see wars everywhere. You see inequalities, terrible inequalities. People in developing countries suffering enormously. You see climate change, and we are not able yet to address effectively this problem. We see artificial intelligence emergence, and nobody is really guaranteeing that it will be a force for good. So there are many problems in the world, and what the Secretary General can do is to convene leaders and to say, let's sit down, let's look into the problems that exist, and let's work together to correct them. Let's make the world with more peace, let's make a world with more justice, with more equity, in which everybody has opportunities, in which young people can have jobs, not only in rich countries, but also in developing countries. Let's have a world in which science and technology is used for the well-being of the people and not for military adventures or for misinformation, disinformation, hate speech spreading and other things that we are witnessing every day. So a Secretary General must be a voice on behalf of the values of the Charter of the United Nations, of international law, of justice and equity, and the Secretary General must be a convener of leaders around the world in order to be able to recognize that there is a lot that is wrong in today's world, and there is a lot we can do together if we come together to solve our problems.
Wow, that's a really, really nice way of saying it and making us understand exactly what it is that you do here. And I'm curious to know, how do young people impact that work that you do? I'm sure they do a lot.
Well, look, climate change is a good example. Temperatures are rising fast. Seawater is rising fast. Seawater levels are rising fast. Emissions are still growing. So we have not yet controlled climate change. And the truth is that political leaders have been reluctant in taking the measures that are necessary in order to be able to tame this beast, climate change. For instance, fossil fuels. Societies remain addicted to fossil fuels. We must move into the direction of phasing out the fossil fuels. And this requires measures, policies, determination from governments, but also from the private sector and also from people in general. Now, climate change is a good example where the most relevant interlocutors are the young people. Because the climate that we are changing today will impact your generation much more than it will impact mine. And my generation has failed in addressing effectively the challenge of climate change. We trust your generation will be more effective than mine, but it is our duty to give the young people not only the possibility to express themselves, but to give them the possibility of their voice not only to be heard, but to have an influence in the decisions that are taken normally, that are taken in the United Nations, and namely in the Summit of the Future that will start with a young people's meeting.
Oh, thank you. I love the fact that you're helping to center our voices in issues that we are going to inherit, like what you said. And something that I really wanted to touch on was about the systems that we're working in here at the United Nations. You said before that we can't build a future for our grandchildren with a system built for our grandparents. And I found that quote to be very, very powerful and something that resonates with so many young people. And a lot of young people in my generation, because I'm here to share their thoughts as well, we think that the current multilateral system is broken and, dare I say, becoming irrelevant. And what's your message to us young people who think and feel that way?
Look, the institutions that were created in order to, I would say, put some order in the life of the world, the United Nations with the Security Council for Peace and Security, the World Bank, the IMF, the Bretton Woods institutions for development and financial stability around the world, and many other institutions in different other sectors. They were created after the Second World War. Yeah. At that time, there were much less countries than today. Many of the countries that are today in the United Nations were at the time still not independent. They were still under a colonial regime. So these institutions were created for a world that is different from today's world. And they were created essentially by those countries that were richer and more powerful, and to a large extent to serve their interests. In between, the world has changed. There are no Africans as permanent members of the Security Council. The only continent that has not one permanent member in the Security Council. It doesn't make any sense. You have 3 European countries as permanent members in the Security Council: France, the UK, and Russia. We need to transform the institutions that were created in order to adapt them to the reality of today's world, to represent today's world, and not the world of 80 years ago. And then the economy is completely different today. And we have a large number of developing countries that did not exist at that time. So the institutions of Bretton Woods were created by a number of countries that are essentially today the developed countries. And they were created largely to serve their interests and their needs at that time that are very different from today's world. And they become smaller in relation to the needs of a global economy that in between has integrated many more actors. Today we have the traditional developed countries, but we have emerging economies like China, like India, like Brazil, Indonesia, and you have then many developing countries that are in need of support. And the truth is that those institutions are outdated, are dysfunctional, and are unfair. And so we need to reform them to represent today's economy, to represent today's world, and at the same time to be able to mobilize much more resources and support to the developing countries that are today in a very difficult situation with high levels of debt that doesn't allow to invest in education, in health, and in so many other aspects, in jobs, that have no access to enough credit at reasonable price to invest in the well-being of their people. So we need to transform those institutions to reflect the world of today and the needs of today, and to be a real safety net for developing countries that are facing so many crises. And this is true for all other sectors. On the other hand, there are things that did not exist at that time. Artificial intelligence. There was no artificial intelligence in 1945. And we all recognize that you need to have some capacity of governance in relation to artificial intelligence. So we need to create the mechanisms, the institutions, or the rules that allow artificial intelligence to be a force for good and not a danger for the future of humankind. So reform the old institutions, adapt them to the realities of today, and create those that are necessary to address the problems that did not exist but are today very important in our world.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree with you more. And I think many young people would agree with you that we need systems that are representative of the things that we're experiencing and seeing today and the things that are coming. So I agree with you a lot on that. And another question that I have is about the Summit of the Future, which we know is coming up in September. There'll be a meeting convening. Now, for those at home who might not know what the Summit of the Future is, could you explain what is it? What will be happening there, and how are young people going to be impacted or involved in this?
It's exactly a moment in which, after a long period of discussion, it started with a report called Our Common Agenda. Then we had a number of policy briefs about the reform that are needed in the whole global governance system. Lots of discussions all over the world that we hope to intensify now as we approach the Summit of the Future. And to discuss what? A new agenda for peace. We have a world at war, conflicts everywhere. We need to invest much more in prevention. We need to invest much more in consolidation of peace. We need to address the problems of new weapons. I am in favor, for instance, of forbidding those autonomous lethal weapons that might be created and could decide themselves who to kill and where and when to kill. This is unacceptable. We must preserve human agency. We must guarantee that the humans are the ones that decide these things, that there is accountability. If something goes wrong, we need to know who's responsible. If it is some mechanism of artificial intelligence, nobody is responsible. So a new agenda for peace. At the same time, we need to look into the reform of the Security Council. We need to look into the reform of international financial institutions, as I mentioned. We need to look into the problems of debt. We need to look into the problems of the investment necessary for the Sustainable Development Goals to make the Agenda 2030 a reality. We are backtracking in relation with many of the Sustainable Development Goals. We need to recover the time that was lost. At the same time, there are problems related to how to regulate the space. Now there are satellites everywhere. No, they start having a risk of, like in a motorway, of crashing with each other. We are facing pandemics, we are facing huge disasters. We are not prepared, we are not organized to be able to face. Look at what happened with the COVID. No, it was chaotic in the world. So we want to discuss how to create an emergency platform that is always present and is able to respond to these needs. And we need to guarantee that there is voice not only for young people, but there is a way to take into account the future generations, those that are not yet born. And nobody thinks about them. But the decisions we are taking now will impact on the life of young people and on the life of those that will come after us. And at the same time, look into gender equality, how to make and stream it in all policies, in all aspects of our activity and of the government policies and things organized by societies, and so on and so forth. How can we, looking into the problems of today, find the adequate mechanisms to be able to have an effective governance of our global public goods?
Yeah, and I think it's great that that's happening, and I love the fact that you say our common agenda. It's about everybody and including everybody. And a question that I know that my fellow young peers will have is, how will you ensure that this meeting and gathering is not just going to be another meeting and gathering of leaders and they're just speaking? How do we make sure that there will be action that comes from this that ensures my future? How will we do that?
Well, first of all, with a participation as wide as possible in relation to the preparation of the summit. And I think, once again, the young people will be crucial on that. There were, in my lifetime, different attitudes of those that are responsible for governments or for institutions like the UN in relation to young people. In the beginning, nobody cared about what young people would think. Then there was an attempt to start sometimes listening to the voice of young people. Then there was a certain moment in which, okay, let's listen, let's discuss, let's give an impression that their opinions matter. But now what we need is to make young people participate in the decision-making processes. And this is the jump that I would like that the forms of governance that the Summit of the Future will discuss will allow for the way we organize global governance in the world.
I really like that. It's about the meaningful engagement of not just doing it to tick a box. It's about, do we actually have the voices of young people represented? And I appreciate you for saying that. You said repeatedly that the fight against the climate crisis is the fight for our lives. And why is climate action so important to achieve a better world? And why does it matter so much to you personally?
It matters for me. First of all, because it's, in my time, the biggest challenge the world is facing, but I have granddaughters, and for my granddaughters it will be very important to have a planet where people can live, and not a planet that was destroyed by climate change. But look at what's happening in today's world, especially in the most fragile countries, in small islands, in developing countries in Africa. You see floods, you see droughts, you see tornadoes, you see heat waves, you see transformations that are making some parts of the world almost impossible to live. We see people that is forced to move, that can no longer continue with their lives where they always were. And you see impacts on health. And especially in the developing countries, you see that the money that would be necessary for education, for health, is being used to rebuild the roads and the harbors and the things that have been destroyed. Now, this is essential as the recognition that this is the central problem that we need to address is essential. And there are many interests that do not want to touch. I mean, the fossil fuel industry, for instance, does everything to give the idea, oh, it's not exactly like that. We always need fossil fuels. We need to do a phase out of fossil fuels and a transition, a just and equitable transition to renewables. And we need to do the same in many other sectors of our activity, in industry, in agriculture, in many other areas, to think that we need to work not only for this generation, but to have a world that is preserved for the future generations.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true, and I resonate so much with what you're saying. And I think you touched on your grandchildren just then, and the question I have is, you've spoken about your grandchildren so openly before and the kind of world that you want to leave for them, and you've just described it there, but how will we get there? How can you ensure that we will get there?
Well, by intervening, by participating, by raising our voice. And this is particularly true for your generation. And also in my generation, doing everything we can. But do not accept that what we have today is inevitable. Do not accept that you cannot transform anything. Look at the impact that youth movements have had in the world with fundamental changes that took place afterwards. So if we want to change the world, we need to fight. If we want to change the world, we need to unite, we need to mobilize, we need to fight for a better future for all, and that means to fight those that want to keep things as they are because they serve their interests, but in a way that would put into jeopardy the perspective of the future of our planet and of the well-being of the people.
I feel so empowered by what you've just said about collaboration, coming together, fighting for the things that we believe in. And I think that's a beautiful message that you've left us with, and I really appreciate that. So thank you. And
thank you very much. It was an enormous pleasure to speak with you.
Of course, and thank you to everybody who's at home who was tuning in to listen to some of these words that we've had from the Secretary-General. I think it was really important to have my burning questions answered to make sure that we're securing our future. So if you have any more questions, you can leave them down below, and I'm sure we can get back to you with some answers. But for that, thank you so much.